crack before they saw it. Not a scream, not a cry, just that sound, like dry branches snapping under a boot. The man's arm didn't break clean. It bent. Hung there. His fingers twitched like they were trying to reach for something that wasn't there. You'd think that was the end. But it wasn't. The executioner stepped back, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his glove, and pointed to the left leg. The wheel creaked. The prisoner groaned. Then came the second strike, then the third, and the fourth. The crowd flinched, but no one left. Not even the children. They stayed, like it was a market game, like there was something worth waiting for at the end of all that noise. He wasn't a murderer. He wasn't a nobleman fallen from grace. He wasn't even anyone. Just a man who stabbed a bailiff in the dark after his son was beaten to death for stealing grain. No trial, no jury, just the wheel. They say it was the fairest sentence the village had seen in years. Justice doesn't always look like balance. Sometimes it looks like splinters and blood, and a man forgetting what his own bones feel like. But here's the real question. Where did this begin? Who decided that a spinning cross of wood and iron should become the voice of law? And why did it speak loudest when it crushed the powerless? This is not just a tale of torture. It's the story of a weapon dressed as justice, a ritual that turned peasants into dust, limbs into pulp, and pain into a public event. Let's turn the wheel back. Before the blood, before the crack, before the man even knew what was coming. They didn't build the wheel to torture. They built it to judge. Long before it screamed through the Middle Ages, the wheel was already turning in darker corners of Europe, slow, deliberate, and cruel in its purpose. It didn't come from a dungeon. It came from a courtroom. Charlemagne's empire, cold and vast, needed order. Not just control, but fear. His laws were carved not only into stone, but into bone. The Lex Salica, the ancient Frankish code, included punishments so brutal they felt almost ceremonial. The wheel was one of them, a response not to petty crimes, but to those who disrupted the ordained order of things. It wasn't about blood. It was about hierarchy. A slave who killed a master. A son who struck a father. A peasant who dared to lay a hand on nobility. These weren't just crimes. They were insults to the structure of God's world. And for that, the world had to watch you break. The earliest uses didn't even bother with showmanship. There was no crowd, no stage, just a flat wheel laid over the body and a hammer to bring the sentence down. Blow by blow, limb by limb. But as centuries passed, something changed. The wheel stopped being a tool and became a theater. By the 11th century, towns began erecting tall poles with wooden crosses mounted atop, turning executions into public rituals. The condemned were no longer just broken. They were displayed, their twisted limbs wrapped between the spokes, suspended over the heads of the living, like some twisted warning carved into the skyline. And people came. Farmers, merchants, children, priests. They watched and waited, not just for justice, but for the moment where a man ceased to be a man and became spectacle. The wheel wasn't turning by itself. It was turned by the eyes of a society that needed to see pain to believe in order. But pain, as it turns out, has layers. And what happened next wasn't quick, because the wheel didn't kill like an axe or a rope. It killed slow, measured, methodical. The sentence was passed, the people gathered, and the hands of the executioner got to work. They didn't tie you to the wheel to kill you. They tied you there to make you last. The body wasn't meant to endure what came next. Arms stretched out along the rim, legs roped down tight, ribs pressing against wood hardened by blood and weather. The executioner didn't rush. He didn't need to. He knew where to start. First came the shin, always the shin. The blow had to be hard enough to shatter the bone, but not so deep that it tore through flesh entirely. If you cracked it wrong, the limb might fall off. Too quick, too merciful. Then the thigh, then the elbow, then the wrist. Each strike wasn't just punishment, it was punctuation. A sentence of pain, written bone by bone. They called it breaking on the wheel. But it wasn't really the wheel that did the breaking. It was the iron bar. Flat, heavy, usually square at the edges, sometimes heated in a forge until it glowed faint orange, if they wanted to mix pain with fire. The goal wasn't death, not immediately. It was separation, of limbs, of joints, of identity. Because after the fifth or sixth blow, something shifted. The person stopped reacting like a person. The screams became garbled. The body flinched, then sagged. The crowd leaned in, not out of sympathy, but curiosity. When the body gives out, what remains? Sometimes the condemned would beg for the coup de grace, a final blow to the chest or neck to end it all. Sometimes they got it. Other times, the silence was their answer. A silence stretched over hours, even days. Because broken didn't mean dead. The real horror wasn't in the pain. It was in the waiting. You lay there, bound to the spokes, vision fading, flies landing on the blood pooling around your hips, knowing it wasn't over. That someone, somewhere, thought this was justice unfolding as planned. And the wheel kept turning, not in motion, but in meaning. Because the point wasn't to execute, the point was to exhibit. And they hadn't even raised you yet. Not until the bones were dust, the breath barely there, and the faces below were ready to look up. They didn't bury you after the wheel. They raised you like a flag. Once the bones were shattered, the ropes were tightened, not to secure you further, but to shape you. The arms were bent backward through the wooden spokes, one twisted over, one under, until the limbs curved unnaturally like branches in a storm. Your legs, broken and useless, were wrapped around the wheel's edge, toes pointing in opposite directions. It wasn't medical. It wasn't precise. But it had to look right. Because now came the pole. Thick, tall, hammered deep into the town square. Or if the crime was worse, into the hillside, where the crows flew free and the air carried screams farther. The wheel, now carrying the man, was lifted up slowly, ropes pulled tight by calloused hands, the kind used to lifting hay or hauling stone. But this wasn't farming. This was display. You weren't a man anymore. You were a message. From a distance, it almost resembled a crucifixion. Arms spread, head slumped, body raised above the people who had once stood beside you in the fields. Only now, they looked up. Not with pity, with a strange mix of fear and satisfaction. Because if you were up there, then they were still safe down here. The wheel turned in the wind, slowly. The sun dried the blood along the spokes. Birds came first, circling, cautious. Then one landed, then another. And still, you were alive. They say some lasted 2 days, maybe more. Not conscious, not whole, but breathing. Your tongue would swell, your throat would close. And the worst part wasn't the pain anymore. It was the stillness, the inability to move, to cry, to fight, only to feel the waiting. Below, life went on. Children pointed, priests crossed themselves, and mothers whispered warnings to their sons. Obey, or you'll end up like him. Because by now, the wheel wasn't punishing one man. It was disciplining an entire village. But who were these men being raised like scarecrows above the fields? What crime was so great that the world needed this much horror to erase it? And why? Did so many of them look like farmers, like laborers, like the ones who never owned a sword or wore a crown? Not all crimes earned the wheel, just the ones that challenged the world's design. You could steal a horse, rob a church, even stab a neighbor in a drunken fight, and walk away with your life. Maybe a hand missing, maybe an ear, but breathing. The wheel was saved for something else, something personal to the state. You didn't just have to commit violence. You had to cross a line that wasn't written in ink, but in blood and rank, like a servant who killed his master, a tenant who attacked his lord, a son who struck his father. These weren't just crimes. They were violations of structure, the invisible scaffolding that held the world in place. Because in medieval Europe, law wasn't built to protect everyone. It was built to preserve the order of things. King over noble, noble over knight, knight over peasant, peasant over nothing. So when a man from the fields raised a blade against a man with a title, it didn't matter why he did it. It only mattered that he forgot his place. And forgetting your place meant having your body used to remind others of theirs. In some villages, there were no trials for these crimes, just public accusation and fast sentencing. If a nobleman was found dead and a tenant was found nearby, that was enough. He'd be tied to the wheel by sundown. In France, the law called them crimes énormes, not enormous in size but in weight. Acts that didn't just break a rule, but disrupted the balance between heaven and earth. Theft didn't qualify, but rebellion did. So did blasphemy. So did killing someone you were supposed to kneel to. And more often than not, the men on the wheel had dirt under their nails, not rings on their fingers, because justice wasn't blind. It saw class, it saw title, it saw power. And the wheel spun fastest when it crushed those who had none. But not every case ended with silence and wind. Some names survived. Some stories were passed down, part memory, part nightmare. And a few of them are still written in the margins of old court records. Names of men and women who went to the wheel not as ghosts, but as legends. Some broke bones, others broke history. And the wheel turned for both. In the forests of Bedburg, Germany, they said, he was a beast, a monster in man's clothing. Peter Stump, the werewolf of 1589, he was accused of murdering livestock, children, and his own son, of making pacts with demons, of wearing a wolf's skin under the moon. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. What mattered was how he died. They broke his limbs with a wheel, tore flesh with red-hot pincers, beheaded him, then burned the remains. Justice, they said. But it looked a lot like ritual. In Austria, a woman named Barbara Kollerin was broken for poisoning her husband. She wasn't noble. She wasn't rich. Just inconvenient. The wheel made sure no one remembered why she did it, only what she became when she did. And in parts of Poland, they added their own twist, breaking the arms first, then weaving the shattered limbs through the spokes like ribbons. Some regions spun the wheel as it hung, making the body rotate slowly under the sun. A carousel of agony. No two towns did it the same, but every one of them knew how to make it hurt. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a tradition, a local craft. Passed from executioner to apprentice, perfected over years. The angle of the swing, the distance of the rope, even the order of the strikes, knee before wrist, wrist before elbow. By the 17th century, the wheel had become a kind of grim signature across Europe, a language of bones and wood, and each time it was used, it said the same thing. This is what happens when fear runs the courtroom, when pain becomes policy, and yet, we remember their names, not always clearly, not always kindly, but the echo stayed, because sometimes the only thing stronger than the wheel is the memory it failed to erase. If this is the legacy of broken peasants and poisoned husbands, imagine what it meant when the church got involved, when the wheel wasn't just about punishment, but about prophecy and what waited beyond the pain. It wasn't just the body that broke on the wheel. Sometimes it was the soul. The church never built the wheel, but it didn't stop it either. In some corners of Christendom, it blessed it. The breaking wheel became more than execution. It became a ritual of cleansing, a theater of divine reckoning. Priests were often present, not to stop it, but to guide the condemned toward confession, because pain had a purpose, not just punishment, but purification. If your bones shattered beneath the eyes of God, maybe your soul had a chance. In sermons, they compared it to the wheel of fortune, the ancient pagan image, later twisted into Christian doctrine. A circle that lifted kings and crushed beggars, spun by the unseen hand of fate, where today you ruled and tomorrow you fell. And when you fell, the wheel was waiting. In the hagiographies of saints, the wheel sometimes even flipped sides. Take Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Legend says she was bound to the wheel for defying a Roman emperor. But when the wheel began to turn, it shattered instead of her. A sign, they said, that God had rejected the tool of tyranny. Still, that didn't stop the church from using it. Not officially, not everywhere, but the silence was loud. Because as long as the condemned asked forgiveness before the final strike, as long as they whispered Christ's name through broken teeth, then their suffering became sacred. A path to absolution written not in prayer, but in agony. It was mercy, they said, even when it looked like hell. Monks recorded the names. Towns built crosses near the poles, and families prayed under the wheels that held what was left of their sons. The line between justice and salvation blurred until it vanished. By then, the wheel was more than law. It was a symbol of power, of fate, of faith twisted into something sharp. But no symbol lasts forever. Even the strongest wood rots. Even the blood dries. And when the screams finally faded from the hillsides, The question remained, who would be the last to break? The wheel didn't vanish. It decayed, slowly, like the bones it once devoured. By the 18th century, Europe was changing. Enlightenment thinkers were speaking of reason, of rights, of reform. But the wheels kept turning. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to remind people that progress wasn't a straight line. It bent around pain. In France, as late as 1789, a man named Robert-François Damiens was broken alive. His crime? Attempted regicide. He stabbed King Louis XV with a penknife. The blade barely drew blood, but the punishment drew everything else. They tore him apart in stages: pincers, boiling oil, molten lead, the rack, and then finally, the wheel. Not because he was dangerous, but because he had touched what was untouchable. And that was the final truth of the breaking wheel. It was never about what you did. It was about who you hurt. A noble, a priest, a king, an idea. In some towns, executioners began refusing the ritual, not out of mercy, out of disgust. The wheel had stopped being fearsome. It had become obscene, a relic of an uglier world that still haunted the new one. But there were still places where it lingered, where the smell of burnt iron and sun-dried blood still hung in the cracks of the square, where the old men remembered, where the birds still circled. And in those places, silence replaced spectacle. No more cheering crowds, no more sermons, just the final creak of timber under weight, the slow hush of an audience that had seen too much, and the wind turning a wheel that no longer had a name to break. The breaking wheel didn't just crush bodies, it crushed voices, it crushed names. It crushed every small defiance that dared rise from the dirt and look power in the eye. And yet, even when the wood splintered and the blood dried and the crowds moved on, the echoes stayed. What was once justice now feels like cruelty. What once kept order now looks like madness. But the truth is, those two things were never that far apart. We remember the nobles who built laws, but we forget the peasants who were folded into their gears. Their names are gone, their faces erased, but their screams, those still ripple in the bones of history. Today we walk free, but the ghosts of those wheels still creak underfoot, quiet, waiting, not for blood, but to be remembered. If this story stayed with you, don't just scroll past it. Like the video, share it, leave a comment, subscribe. That's how these voices, these lost, broken voices, keep speaking. And if you want more blood, more betrayal, more darkness carved into royal skin, then explore the playlist Royal Blood and Tortures, the dark medieval tales. We'll see you in the next story. And next time, it won't be the wheel that turns. It'll be the crown.